All right, welcome to those that are joining us today for a day of Fusion ShopBot training. This is going to be a series of sessions to be able to get to the end product of what we see on the screen now. Today, we're going to take a look at the basic two-dimension drawing and creating just one of the items that's going into this assembly. Fusion works a little bit differently than CAD programs that you might be used to. Those that are coming from the world of Inventor or SolidWorks, you're going to be much more familiar with what's happening and going on here. But even transitioning from SolidWorks or Inventor, there's some differences that apply. So what Fusion is, it's more mechanical-based software that allows us to create individual components or parts and then assemble them as one to be able to constrain, lock them in, and build an assembly. And it's one way to really verify if all the parts are going to fit and function before you actually cut the product, build the product, and then in the end find out that that hole is in the wrong location. So what we see on the screen here now is the product that we're going to do. We have it fairly well constrained. This is a game that is called Shoot the Moon. The idea of this game is we would set a little ball down here with this incline, and these here you raise in and out to try to get that ball to roll up the slope and drop it into the correct hole. So this is just a very basic assembly that we have. And again, today what we're going to be doing is focusing on drawing just the bottom section. And I have a quick little drawing of what we have here. But before we get into the drawing, we have to orient ourselves with what Fusion is and how it lays out and works. So the first thing that we're going to look at is just the user interface, the basic user interface. On the left side that we see here is kind of your projects. I call it the data pane. We could hide and show this pane by clicking the button here with the 9 little rectangles. This is the area that is going to show all of your projects, all projects that are like pinned by you, all projects and projects that are shared with you or projects that you have shared. So this is a great way to work on a project as a team. You're able to share a project and multiple people are able to input and work on this project at the same time. So the first thing that we have, again, is the organization of what we have over here on the left side on the data pane. I am only showing projects that are owned by me. Then once we're done with like the data pane organizing that, across the top section is the application bar. In the application bar, we have a couple items here that we're going to take a look at and what we're going to be focusing on. The design is where we create the main product, the main part, the components and such. The other one we're going to look at is manufacturing and drawing. To simplify things, we're going to ignore all the other options here. So design is where we model and draw the part. Drawings are where we create a two-dimensional drawing to be able to dimension the product out. So example is this was created from the two-dimensional drawing section of Fusion. It is slightly confusing when you come into Fusion from programs like VCarve and you see drawing, and that's where you might want to head. That is not where we're going to go to draw the product. We're going to start with design. So to get into this and to start a new project, I'm going to come over to the data pane and open this up. And we're going to learn more about this as we go along. All components are able to be shared with one another. And only components or models that are within the same project could be shared with one another. So if I have my project up here, Arcade, and this product here that has a several parts underneath of it, I cannot share or link this part into this project. I'm able to make a copy of it and put it in here, but I'm not able to have it linked. We'll learn more about that as we go and as the days go on. So the first item that I would do is create one main project. That main project will end up including all of your parts that you would ever make or that you would ever want to have shared within the project. So I created that with this project that's called Mine. So that's all of my projects. Even though we have this item up here that's owned by me, each one of these listings here is a separate project. So inside of this Mine project, I have created a folder and then a part. So all of the items and models that are inside of this project folder or this project grouping can be shared within all projects. That hopefully will become more clear in the next days as we learn about assembly. We'll focus more on that on this Thursday. So what we're going to do is create a new folder here, and I'm just going to call this Shoot the Moon 2. And that just created a folder that I'm able to then add projects or add models and drawings to. So there is the folder on the right side. I'm mainly going to be focusing within the application bar and our drawing canvas down below. So I'm going to close our data pane. And we have multiple designs that we're able to have open at the same time. Currently, I only have this main that is open, and then we have this plus sign right here. This plus sign allows us to start and open up a new model or a new design. If we close the project or the assembly or whatever we have here, if we close it, I can save my changes. It always will keep a untitled or a working version or a space opened up. You can never just simply close and completely close out of everything. It will always have an untitled version. So this is where we're going to start with the untitled, which is basically going to the same thing as going to new and new design. So now we can see we have Untitled 1 and Untitled 2. So again, closing Untitled 1 leaves just one version of a workspace open. To help orient ourselves with what we might be used to, there are a couple changes that we're going to make to our preferences. One is the key, is the first one we're going to make. If you have opened up Fusion before, you will notice that your Z is really Y, and when you click the top, Y is facing up. That is not how we want to have oriented. Z is up. So to see what our preferences are, if you go into upper right will be your name, and you would select Preferences. And you have this option right here, Default Modeling Orientation. Z is up. By default, it's set to Y up, but Z is up. Kind of helps orient us a little bit more familiar with what we were used to on our CNC machines. So setting it that way is good. Okay, so now what we have to create a part is we have sketches and bodies. Sketches are used to sketch out a two-dimensional version of our product or of our part to later extrude that part to thickness. So rule number one in anything creating with Fusion is creating components and putting objects and new parts on a new component. So think of a component as an actual part. So just to point out, I will come back in and open up the original one. And so even though this opens up as one item, it is made up of several components. So if 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different components that make this assembly. So that is what you want to think of as a component is a part that you would cut separately. So once we have Z up set in our preferences, we're ready to start drawing and sketching things out. Before we do that, orientation in clicking around in this space is somewhat confusing. The center mouse button is a pan, allows you to move and pan around. If you hold the shift key down and the center mouse button is the orbit that allows you to rotate around. You could also just come up left clicking the orbiting cube, and you could rotate that cube around. If we want to see the top side, you would simply click the top. If you want to see the front side, you would click the front. And you could also click angling it there. That might be better seen on once we have a part here. But the first thing we're going to do to create and start drawing is creating a sketch. Again, a sketch is what is the two-dimensional drawing that is going to represent the 3D shape or the actual part that we're going to build on. So again, rule number one, always make a component. So I'm going to right click and click new component. So this is our browser tree that gives us a history of what is going on in all of our different components listed here. So right now it's saying unsaved because nothing has been saved. So let's make that the first step. And we'll call this, call it a base 2 because I already have a base 1 in here. I'm duplicating. And the location to save it to, under mine, shoot the moon, should have in here a mine, shoot the moon 2. So I'm going to make sure that it goes into that folder to try to help make sure that we keep the project organized in what we're doing. So it's going to go into the Shoot the Moon 2 folder with the name of base and click save. Now you might be wondering, well, where did that save? It didn't see any C drive. I didn't see any of that. Well, this is where the cloud comes in. It's floating up there somewhere. And it's always there when you're online. So that is, well, it used to be a thing to try to get used to, but with the cloud being what it is today, it's fairly easy to start understanding that. So now to create a sketch or the 2D representation of our part is going to the section up here to create sketches. Once you click the sketch, it gives us our plane here. We have the different planes, X, Y, and Z plane. To draw this part, I typically like to draw everything on the top view, looking straight down as if the orientation that we would be cutting this part out. So if this is a part that we're cutting from top down, that's where I'm going to place my two-dimensional sketch onto. So I'm going to set the plane to the top. And again, I'm going to rotate this around so you can see how when you select on each plane here, it kind of goes gray. That means that is the plane that we're going to draw on. You could also get yourself oriented by seeing the cube on here. We have the top, right, and left side, or the front side. So to help orient it, so I'm just going to simply click on the top view plane, and then it aligns it to a top looking straight down on it. At this point, we have our sketching tools and our application pane, application bar has changed to objects or items that you might be more familiar with. And again, a pan is the center mouse button, and we're just going to quickly sketch out the shape. I'm not going to worry a whole lot about the sizes of it. I'm just going to basically sketch out the shape that I want to have here. I'm not going to sketch in these tenons on the outside. I'm just going to quickly sketch in the basic interior shape. And then later we'll look at how to constrain and lock it all together. And that is where the real power of Fusion comes into it, is with constraints and parametrics. And we'll learn all about that. So to sketch out a line, we're just going to use the line tool. And then anywhere in the space, again, I'm not worried about exactly where it's being drawn, X, Y, or Z, because when we go to cut this, we're able to reorient the location of it. So this is just the location of where this part is going to be drawn in space, not actually where it's going to be cut. So with the line tool selected, just going to, again, quickly sketch out. And as we're sketching out, we see the dimension on the left side is changing. Then we also get a degree that is changing. And then notice when I go to at 90 degrees, we get this little blue symbol that pops up right there. And that is saying that it is going to be a vertical constraint. And we'll see what that means. And then we also, going this way, have a horizontal constraint. If you do not want the snapping, as you see, I'm snapping and it automatically kind of snaps to 90 degrees. If you do not want that to snap at 90 degrees, if you hold the control down as you are moving and drawing around, it does not snap. So again, I do want that to be snapped at a vertical plane. Going to move over to the right, and notice that we aren't getting that constraint horizontal there, but we are getting a little 90-degree right triangle or a right angle constraint there pointing out. So I'm going to select there, and notice that symbol is changed here. So those are what constraints are all about, and we'll see what those are as we come in. I'm just going to draw out roughly the size that it needs to be. It's roughly 17, 18 inches long. Snapping 90 degrees up. All right, so now we have this shape here. It's not quite closed. It's not what we want, but now it's time to kind of lock this in and try to constrain all of our items through dimensioning and construction lines. We do have a couple constraints that were automatically placed in. These are the right angle, so that means that this line section here can always be and will always be right angle to one another. This is a constraint for vertical, so that means when we move this point, this line will never rotate. As an example, I'm going to right-click and delete that constraint. Now that means that you can see everything is moving. It's at an angle. It's just kind of all over the place. Hard to really control what's going on. But notice this line down here, with that being a 90-degree constraint, that is staying at 90 degrees to that line. So to start really constraining and pulling this all together is we have our constraints listed above here. So if this line, if I always want to have that line horizontal, I'm going to use the horizontal vertical constraint, selecting it, it turns blue, and then coming down and selecting the object that I want to have constrained. Now, some of the issues that you end up with over constraints will not allow you to select and create those. So removing those and doing a horizontal constraint there. This one I want to have as a horizontal. And here is one of the options that you get when you're over constrained. So it's telling me that I can't do that because one or more of the other constraints is giving me issues. So that kind of sometimes plays into when you have the automatic constraints that kind of happen, and it's sometimes difficult to see where they're constraining to. So I'm going to remove those constraints. I've now separated those. We're okay with that. I'm going to use our constraining tool here again to a horizontal. And we have this coincidence constraint. This allows us to connect two ends together. That's saying that I always want to have this point and that point together. I'm going to do the same thing for this point and this point. So there is kind of the basic closed shape with 4 horizontal and vertical constraints. Hitting the escape key gets us back out of all of our selected tools and just into our regular movement commands. Well, you see, we're still able to shift things around, and we want to have more control over top of this. And the idea of constraints and what we want to be able to do is be able to lock all of these points in through constraints and dimensioning, that none of, when you move one point, the whole product, all of our lines shift with that point. So the first thing I want to do is keep symmetrical. So the left side or the bottom side and the top side from the midpoint, I want to have the same. So to do that, we're going to use a construction line. So construction lines are drawn and can be constrained the same way that a line itself is drawn, although it is ignored when we go to create the push-pull, the extrusion of this part, which we will see in just a few minutes. So to create a construction line, it doesn't matter what order you do this in. You could click the line tool and then come over here to the construction and put a checkbox there, or you could click the construction box and then come over to the line. It doesn't matter. I'm going to start the line and notice that I have this X that is snapping to that line, meaning that is going to be constrained, or my construction line is going to be constrained to this vertical line. Moving closer to the midpoint shows that that line is now snapping to the midpoint. So I'm going to do it, click from the midpoint of that line, and going to come over here to the opposite end and also snap that line also to the midpoint. Hitting the escape key, again, closes out and gets you out of all of the tools. So we now have a construction line that is with the two endpoints snapped and locked into the midpoint of both ends. So again, when we move these around, now we can see that they are kind of going symmetrically from that midpoint. The one thing that is not set is we are not completely symmetrical because our construction line is set at an angle. It is not a horizontal line. So we want to make and constrain our construction line horizontal. So selecting the horizontal tool and coming down and selecting the construction line. And we could draw that, stretch that back out to get that drawn. And when you start constraining, you'll notice that some weird things start happening like that. But that's okay. We're starting to lock in and start really confining and scaling this down. So we have an endpoint here and an endpoint right here. So we also want to be able to constrain that. There are several ways of doing this. You could just use simply constraints to constrain this point to this point, horizontal or vertical to one another. I like to use the construction lines because it's more visual to see what's going on. So snapping a line across both of those and changing that to a horizontal point. We can see by doing that, that helps control us a little bit more on the width here. So we're almost constrained. So we can see we're pretty well constrained top and bottom. Now we just need to go horizontally with that. And at this point, we're locked in both in our sizes or with our shape. Now we have to start dimensioning our size, and this is going to finish locking and constraining everything down. So I'm just going to jump over to our 2D view so I could see what we have for dimensions here. So I have 7 inches on the outside, 3 inches in, and I'm actually missing a dimension. It should be, I need to know what this number is from end to end. I believe it's 17 inches. So 7, 3, and 17. So I'm first going to draw a dimension line to set the size from this line here, setting that by clicking the dimension tool. And that line was already pre-selected, so that's what it is saying that you want that dimension to be, or where you want that to be set from. If I just escape that, if nothing is selected, you see no dark blue, selecting the dimension line now wants you to come down and select a line that you want to have dimensioned. Okay. Now it's asking for a size. So simply I'm going to enter in 1.5, and that sets that size dimension here. The dimension tool is still in effect. I know that because the blue square around the dimensioning, and also if you notice underneath my mouse cursor, it's got like a little dimension lines there that says I'm in the dimensioning tool. So I'm able to continue selecting lines that I want to have dimensioned. I'm going to set this side to be 3 inches. Now I want to go, and this is an angled line, so you might think that you're going to select that, and well, no. I want to get a dimension from this point to this point. And there's a couple ways of doing that. I could just simply dimension the construction line, which is one reason that I like to have construction lines drawn. Or I could select the outside. That's really not what I want yet. But then come over and select the other line, which is going to now create that horizontal dimension that I'm going to make 17 inches. The one final dimension that we want is this outside, and we're going to make that 7 inches. So that is the basic dimensioning of the product in our basic oversize of the item. So I got a recommendation to go from inches to millimeters. I don't know why people in millimeters, it's so much more of a challenge dividing by 1/128th. But if you really want to take the easy way out and divide by 10, all that is set in your preferences, and you can set your units and how you work within this Fusion here. All right, so now that we have pretty much a fully constrained item, and we could see that simply because I am able to move and grab any one of these lines here or endpoints, and you see the whole object moves with it. There isn't any point or any line that is outside of the, nothing else that is moving. So the beauty of Fusion now is, now if I realize this dimension I did not want to have at 3 inches. I wanted it to be 4 inches. You could simply double click on that, enter in 4, and you see that is stretched out symmetrically from our midpoint construction line to 4 inches. Gets even better than this. So we are now going to see how we could go from this to an actual 3-dimensional shape or product. So we are done with the sketching. So we're done with the sketching. We could click Finish Sketch, and that just gives us the highlight of the sketch. So even though it kind of looks the same, we are not in our sketch at all anymore. And I should mention there are 100 different ways of doing this exact same or getting to this same goal. This is just one way that I've kind of found my way into it. Again, I use construction lines in my sketches a lot. I know a lot of other people don't, and just constrain from one point to another point. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just this is how I'm accustomed to and the way I learned. So at this point, our sketch is closed, and we could see in our browser tree here, we have our sketches. And I can always get into that sketch again by right-clicking and coming down and clicking Edit Sketch, brings up those dimensions, and I could change those. Okay, click Finish Sketch. And now what I want to do is use our push-pull tool to extrude this to give it thickness. And I click that right here with the press pull. Clicking inside of the object, you see how they kind of turns black. Selecting there brings up some dimensions and a distance. I'm just going to simply rotate this around because we get this arrow that is showing up. I can grab that arrow and stretch that out. And I am going to be cutting this out of 1/2 inch material. So I'm just going to simply enter in 0.5 and then enter. Now we have a part or part of the part that we want. If you noticed in our 2-dimensional drawing here, we had some circles and a couple tendons off on the ends. So we're going to take a look at creating the circles first. The circles are also on a sketch. And as we saw when we first created the sketch for here, we chose a axis plane to draw that sketch on. Now that we have an actual item, we're able to select faces to sketch on top of. So the top side, I can see I'm viewing the top side by the top cube here. And you notice when you hover your mouse over top of the product, you see it kind of shading a different colored gray. That means that is going to be the selected face, or you're selecting that face. So this time when we go to create a sketch, our axis planes shown up here, only this time I'm not going to select the axis planes, I'm going to select the top face of our product. We are now in the same sketching pattern as we were prior when we were drawing the outline. This time, what we're going to do is draw out our circles. We have 6 circles, and again, there is a couple different ways of doing this. I could draw just one circle and use a pattern copy, or I could draw out 6 copies and kind of link them and constrain them together. So I'm going to do just that. I'm going to draw a total of 6 circles. I'm not really going to worry about the spacing of them or the sizing of them, just going to come through. And I'm also not allowing them to constrain automatically to one another. As you become more efficient in understanding the constraints, you would want to draw them out constraining to one another. Just one more here, just set. So now with the circles created, want to start constraining and locking these in. And again, like I said, I like to use the construction lines. There are other ways of doing it, but construction lines is one way for me to visually see that these lines, or here is a plane, a line, and all locked together. So I'm going to simply click the line tool and come over to the options and set that to be a construction plane or a construction line. These lines need to be, circles all need to line up through the center of our product. So I'm going to snap to the center and then automatically snapping my construction line to the center of each circle. And then the last point, I'm snapping to the midpoint. Hitting escape to clear out all of the tools. And now it's time to start constraining everything together. The first I want to do is set the diameter of all of these circles to be the same. So I'm going to first start by selecting the dimension tool, selecting the one circle that I want to dimension, and enter in the size of that. So that is going to be 1.5 inches, and I want all the other circles to be the same. So you can come in and dimension each individual circle separately, but again, it is very nice to be able to change just one number and have all the other ones change with it. And for that, we're going to use the Constraint Equals tool. And sure enough, it looks just like an equal sign. So I am going to click that and select that. It goes shaded blue. And I want to have this circle to be equal in diameter to this one. And we see that it added that constraint there. Now you can't just continue on and say this all need to be equal. I'm going to select each one individually, and you notice the master for each one gets added another circle to it. And again, there's probably another dozen different ways of being able to constrain the size of those circles altogether. I like to do it the way I did it. In having one using the master, I could have said this one equal to this one, then this one to this one, and so on. But having all of these here linked to the one that is set dimensioned kind of helps me organize things a little bit later down the road. So at this point, I want to start aligning all these circles and get them in a straight line. To do that, we're going to use the horizontal vertical tool and simply select that line that I want to have horizontal. And as we do this, things are going to shift around. Circles are going to get all out of whack. That's okay. I'm going to just drag them over and kind of do them one by one. One more I'm going to bring over, make sure it fits there. This line to be horizontal. So now all of those circles are locked in a horizontal constraint. They cannot move up or down. They could still move horizontally across our shape. And that is all right. So the next thing that I did dimension. So the spacing between each hole is 2.38 inches. So again, using the dimensioning tool, I'm going to dimension just one of our construction lines. I'm going to label that 2.38. And then again, using the equals, the same as we did for the circle, we are going to make and constrain each horizontal construction line to be equal to our dimension line. Again, hitting the equal sign, that line is equal to this one. Again, just going through and selecting them all to make sure that they all have the same value. So by having that and having all of these lines equal, we are now constrained in the spacing of all these circles linked to one dimension. If I wanted to set that spacing a little bit greater, just double clicking on that dimension and changing that, and we can see that they all grew out equally. The other dimension that we need is the one right here, and just going back to my two-dimensional, it's 3.5 inches. That line selected, and use the dimension tool and change that to 3.5, and there is our layout. So now we have 6 holes here, and they are all constrained to one another. And as we see, you grab and try to move any one of them. They do not move in any direction. That is telling me that they are fully constrained and locked in place. So with the constraints being set to the midpoint of this line and our original sketch also being linked to the midpoint, so when we change one, they will always be linked in the center. So once that is all done, we're going to click to finish this sketch, and we see the two-dimensional sketch representation on top of our part. Again, using the same push-pull, I'm going to come in and select all of the circles that I want to modify. I'm just going to rotate this in an area so we can see what's happening. So I can pull them out this way and have them pop up, which is not what we want. If we want holes, we would simply pull them all the way through and down, but they're just pocketed out holes that are cut 1/4 inch into the material. So I'm going to enter in a -0.25 and then enter. So that closes the sketch tools, and we are now have 2 sketches, our main sketch, and then our sketch on top of it, which is the circles. Through all of our process of creating this object, Fusion is also keeping a timeline or a list of operations that have been completed. And we can see that down below here. So we have a sketch number 1, our extruded tool, sketch number 2, and then our extruding of those holes. So if we don't want to see those holes, you could simply move this bar over into the timeline to kind of hide them. They're still there. They're just moved back in time before they were created. So we can move forward into the future by moving that slider bar to the right. If later we realized that we want to not have that hole cut at 1/4 inch, we only want it to be 1/8 inch, on that extrude, you simply double click it. It brings up the edit feature for extruding, and you could just simply change the value of that number right here. And again, if we realize that, oh, those holes should not be 1.5 inches, they should only be 1 inch, we could simply right-click on our sketch and select Edit Sketch and change the value of this here to 1 1/8. And all of those holes, since we've constrained them to be equal, all go to the same size. And again, to get out of the sketch, we're going to click Finish Sketch. So the final 2 items that we need to draw in place here is the tenons off on the outside here. Got one on the left side, one on the right side. To draw that, I am going to have a total of 2 more sketches, one on the right end, one on the left end. And to create a sketch again, just simply coming up to Create Sketch and selecting the face or the plane that you want to have this sketch applied to. So selecting the endpoint, we are now sketching on the end of our product, or they're calling it's actually the left side. I'm just going to draw out a rectangle using the rectangle tool. I will now need to constrain this rectangle. So as we see, we can stretch and move that anywhere we want. The first thing I want to do is make this bottom side to be equal or the same location. So I'm going to use the coincidence tool, selecting the point, the two objects are the point to the line, and we see now that is now connected to the bottom. When we move around, it is not moving off of the bottom, but it is staying. So there's two other dimensions that we need to stretch this by. The one that I'm going to do here, and again, a couple ways of doing this. I could draw out two construction lines, one from the endpoint to here, and this endpoint to this one, then use the equals tool to make this one equal to this one. Or I could use a construction line again and draw a line or construction line from the midpoint to the top midpoint. So I'm going to try it that way. So I'm going to go to the line, making sure that it's set to construction, snapping to the midpoint, and then coming up to the top, and also snapping to the midpoint there. That horizontal, or that line here, we want to have vertical. So just simply clicking the horizontal vertical tool. We have now constrained our rectangle to be basically symmetrical left and right. At this point, I'm just going to use the dimensioning tools to finish and lock all of the constraints in. I'm going to set the height of this one point to there and setting that to be 1/4 of an inch. From the endpoint to the endpoint, I want to have maybe 3/4 of an inch. Now you might want to set, we could have dimensioned the endpoints here as I did, or I could have dimensioned the point in the center here. So again, if you don't want that dimension, you simply click delete and we're done. So you see how that just kind of brought back. There is one thing that I'll mention that's happening here is when we right click, so I'm selecting this, right clicking, and as I rotate this around, we see this cone, shoot out from the center of our rotation. This is used to say that when the mouse is in this kind of cone here, we're going to do an undo. When it's in this section here, it is going to be a delete. So this helps and very useful as you become familiar with the software and being able to get around in doing what's called gestures. So knowing that the undo is directly to the left, we're going to see how that works. I'm going to delete that. And when you right click, you get this line that stretches. So we just simply click and drag, and the menu didn't pop open, but that was a gesture to the left to indicate undo, which undid this. So the delete I knew was in the kind of this area up here from the center. So I could select and just stretch right up to where that virtual delete would have been by seeing that right click. So gesturing in that helps speed up the process of designing a lot faster. So again, I had that dimension on the outside. I could have also just dimensioned this line right here to keep it symmetrical. And let's say that 5 inches. And now that is with the constraint to midpoint, it is keeping equal distance off of each end. So with that side complete, I'm going to finish the sketch. And again, we see the outline of that sketch. And I want to extrude or pull that sketch off of the product outwards by 3/8 of an inch and enter. So I'm going to rotate around, and I'm doing that by holding the shift key down, the center mouse button or the center wheel. I want to draw a sketch on the face of the right side. With that selected now, pre-selected, when I hit the sketch tool, it's automatically going to scale in and focus and know that I wanted that right side to be my sketch plane or my sketch face. So I'm going to do the same exact process, sketch out a rectangle. And just start constraining this in place. Now, if there is a time where that's a line that really should have been a construction line, we could change that by simply right-clicking on that line. Adjuster undid what I did. So midpoint to midpoint. That is a line, not a construction line. It's not a construction line because I didn't click the construction line first. You don't have to delete it. You don't have to start over. You could just simply right-click and come down and say that you want it to be a construction line. And the opposite of that, if you have a construction line, you wanted to make it an actual sketched line, you could right-click and come back down and say that it is a normal line. So it's a toggle. So with that being a construction line, I'm going to use the horizontal tool, and then dimension. We are going to finish this sketch using the push pull. Also going to pull that out by 0.375. Then OK. So now this is the base of one item. Now there's a couple ways that we're able to do this. We could build on top of this with multiple components within one model. You could do that, and that's OK. And I would only do that if you know that you will never want to use any one of these parts in another model or another assembly again. So I like to have them completely separate, and then later we will join them and build them together. So this is really the starting point or the key products or processes of creating drawings and sketches. Next week, we're going to look a little bit, or not next week, I'm sorry, Thursday, we're going to focus on how do we make more of these objects, and also how are we going to create an assembly of this. So it is an unsaved item. I know that because the asterisk is listed there. It's going to come over here and click Save, and then Save. So to explain a little bit about assemblies and the reason why I like to have them completely separate and not have all of these in here, because I could come in and do a new component and have multiple components within this main model here. But once we do that, we are kind of not able to use any one of these components in another product or another item again. So I don't like doing that. That's preferences are up to you. We'll focus a little bit more on that next week when we talk about assembling these and putting those together. So I'm going to close that, and I'm not going to save it with that added item there. So assembly is what we have right here. just a quick overview so we could see what we're going to look at tomorrow, or I'm sorry, Thursday. I just hit a new product. We have a blank canvas again. It is untitled. I'm going to open up my data panel, and I already have these parts drawn out. So there is the base. So with that base done and complete, I'm just going to drag that over into my modeling space. It does want me to save first. I'm just going to call that test. And now it's brought in. I can move this around, but I'm not really worried about exactly where it's placed because, again, this is just for visualizing where we are, not about where it's going to cut. I'm going to say OK. Now, one thing that you've noticed in the tree, we have this little linkage chain there. That means that it is linked to this design or that product. So if I have and use this in multiple assemblies or multiple products across a series of a product line, I could edit just once and it will automatically change all of the other products as well, as long as they are linked together. Again, we'll talk more about that on Thursday. Just to view how an assembly is done, to get an overview, here is the foot, which is the bottom section that is here. Just going to drag that in and place it down. So if you are coming from SolidWorks or Inventor to constrain or assemble, you usually have to have multiple constraint points. Fusion calls them joints. So this joint, if I want to have, first I'm going to ground this product right here, meaning it's not going to move. Right click, make that ground. And again, this is not part of this, is an overview. We'll get more detail about this later. So I'm going to make a joint. I'm going to make that point the same as that point right there. I didn't select the right point. I should have selected out here. So to do that, I'm going to click the X here and come in and select that point. And we can see that that has just locked itself into place and setting its location. And we can see, based on constraints that I have set and locations, that we have a collision here. We'll talk more about that next Thursday and learn how we could avoid collisions like this and learn more about constraining and also being able to add motion and rotational linkages in joints together. So I know we didn't get into cutting or even learn how to cut yet, but we have to really learn how to be able to draw within Fusion and design within Fusion and be able to understand the basics of Fusion before we can go farther. So again, rule number one in Fusion is always create and work in components. So that is right-clicking, creating a new component. You can give that component a name right here. And then we would be working within this component here, always drawing out the product that you want on and making it as that component. There's the component one with multiple components, create a new component, and also basically work the exact same way. And you're able to build and use the existing component to build on top. Not necessarily how I would do it, but you can. Next Thursday, this Thursday, we will learn why you might want to do one versus the other. So hopefully this is going to take a total of 4 sessions to be able to get to our finished product. So this Thursday, we're going to learn how to quickly draw out the rest of the parts needed for this, and then create them as an assembly to be able to test fit to see if the function of the product works. Then the third session is going to talk some about two-dimensional drawings and some manufacturing. And then on the fourth day is going to be a kind of a wrapping up and pulling it all together and showing maybe another project or product as a complete start to finish, because this was an hour's time that we took to draw just that one part. Don't let that time scare you in using Fusion. If I was not training and teaching this, the whole complete assembly product here, I think took me 15, 20 minutes to completely draw that out. So don't let the time that it took me to draw just that one part shy you away from being able to jump in and design in Fusion. It is not as hard as it looks. Well, maybe it is, but it's not hard after you know what you're doing with it. So hopefully after the next 3 or 4 sessions, you all will be comfortable with using Fusion and having a good understanding on how we could take a Fusion model to our ShopBot.